Peace, Shanti, Shalom, Salam, Walakhonta, may peace be with you. For thousands of years, the teachings of all wisdom traditions are clear. Humanity is one. All life is one. All are in God's image. There is no difference between self and other. And yet, for thousands of years, humans have broken that vision of peaceful coexistence and waged war against each other in an orgy of violence, both personal and political. As a child, I grew up as one among many. It was not unusual when at my grandparents' dining table to be surrounded by people of a wide variety of beliefs and backgrounds. Among their friends typically were Christians and Jews, Muslims and Hindus, Buddhists and humanists, tribal folk from around the world. This was my world. This was my normal. I was one among many, one of the many of God's likenesses, all sheltered beneath the overshadowing dome of heaven, each part of the whole hoop of the world where all live together like one being. I learned that the Christian path of my family was one among many, and that being one among many was a beautiful thing. This was the way that the scriptures of the wisdom traditions described the world, the way that the great teachers, prophets, and poets taught about humanity and our relationship to each other. At my grandfather's dinner table, I learned that I could celebrate the story of my religion as well at the same time as learning from those from different paths. What a wonderful world this is in all of our diversity. Male and female, we were created different nations and tribes. We were created united in mind and heart. We were created in this way. Our life force is the thread that binds us together in our common humanity, to each other, to all living beings, and to the earth, our mother. In this way, we are but a part of the wholeness of life. But as I grew up, I began to realize that most other people did not share my one among many experience, at least not in a positive way. They did not see themselves as parts of the nations and tribes created all in God's image, did not feel that connection to the wholeness at the heart of humanity. Instead, I heard people talk about others different from themselves as foreign, as others, as unbelievers, as heathen, as people to be feared, as people to be hated. This made me sad as a child. It makes me weep now. Human diversity can evoke appreciation of the beautiful, unique expressions of a larger whole, one among many. Or when these differences are experienced through a fear-based lens, can lead to the poisons of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all the other fear-based diseases that infect our society. We see this all around us in the world today. Purveyors of fear, spreading the nonsense of a clash of civilizations or the heresy of the superiority of one race, gender, nationality, or religion over another, all in order to gain power, pitting people against each other. For centuries, prejudice-based violence have been violent ways in dealing with people of different cultures or beliefs. All has produced genocide, Holocaust, crusades, slavery, the horrific interpersonal violence, often against the most vulnerable, each having its roots in the dehumanization of the other, often justified by exclusive claims of truth by one religion or another. We are living this nightmare once again in this country. There is no place for exclusivism and its offspring superiority or supremacy in our world. They violate the core tenets of all religions, of all wisdom traditions, of all humanist values. Exclusivism, supremacy, superiority are heresies. They are sacrilegious, desecrating the essence of spiritual and humanistic traditions they claim to represent. They are beliefs forged out of limited perspectives, rooted in ignorance, often inflamed by the lust for power. In looking to illustrate this dynamic among humans, I came up with a very low-tech example, first developed for children who were wonderful at explaining this, then used with adults who are less wonderful at explaining this. Imagine we were sitting in a circle around the box. It works a little better that way, but it will work this way too. The question for you is, how do you know what the box looks like? How do you know what the box looks like? Now, there are two basic rules. The first is you can't move from your seat, because your seat is your perspective. It's what's been forged over a lifetime, the things you've learned, the ways in which you see the world. That is your perspective on the box, on the world, on reality. And the second, you can't move the box. When I'm doing this in smaller groups, adults often say, "Why can't I move the box?" Who says I can't move the box? You can't move the box. So from your perspective, how do you know what the box looks like? Any ideas?
A white rectangle.
It looks like a what rectangle?
A gray square.
Great. It's a gray square. That's what the box looks like, a gray square. How do you know what the whole box looks like? The first lesson of the box, or the world around us, is that we are limited by our perspective from seeing the multi-dimensional reality in which we live. The second lesson of the box is we need to hear perspectives of others in order to have a more complete picture of the world around us. We understand the world only in as much as we share and create that understanding together. We need each other. We need to hear each other's perspectives in order to know what the box, what the world looks like beyond our own perspective. As human beings, our perspectives shaped by our life experiences are both unique and uniquely valuable and limited. This may be the hardest lesson for humans to understand. Our perspectives are valuable and they are partial, always. Another lesson of the box is that it is possible that a person's view of the box is so close or so one-sided that they don't even realize there is a box. All they see is one dimension of reality. Therefore, perspectives learned in isolation can lead to exclusivist views of the world. When I look at the box, my box is a green square. When you look at the box, it's a gray rectangle. It's not a gray rectangle, it's a green square. That's what I see. That's my perspective. Unless we connect, unless we share our perspectives, we will always have a partial and limited view of reality. The assault on diversity, which has been my entire life's work in this country, is an attempt to obscure the reality of our interdependence and cultivate exclusivist, fear-based views that can be easily manipulated. So let's say I hold this absolute view that the box is a white background with a green square. I'm certain of it because that's what I see. I look at the box, I see a green square, case closed. That's reality. If I'm rigid, then your view of the box as a gray rectangle or an orange circle or a purple star cannot be true. And if you are as rigid as I am about defining what the box looks like from my limited perspective, we have what seems like an irreconcilable conflict. I may find myself gathering others who share my green square worldview. The algorithms on social media connect me to other green square viewing people. The news that I consume may mostly be about green square perspectives, reinforcing my green square view of the world, denying your perspectives on the world. Those of us with the green square perspective may believe that our worldview is the only truth. We may create theories and theologies to justify our green square perspective and superiority, knowing through empirical evidence that the green square perspective is the only true worldview, and that the others, those orange and purple and gray people who in their ignorance are unable to appreciate the green square perspective on the world. Whether it be culture, family, gender, race, religion, political alliance, or whatever aspect or aspects of our story define our worldview, our identity as an individual or group, when perceived as exclusive or superior to others, this prevents us from seeing others as essential partners in the collective understanding of the world, of our lives, of the multidimensional reality in which we live. If our perspectives are so limited by our own experience that we see only our particular view, if our identities are forged around this single aspect of who we think we are, we live in isolation, cut off from the power of the deeper awareness of our interdependence. United, I have made your hearts. All human beings are one, belonging to one humankind. The oneness of the human family teaches us that peace, true peace, peace through interdependence is necessary. So one of the people regularly around my grandparents' table was Dr. Thurman. Dr. Howard Thurman was a Universalist Christian who understood himself as one among many. There is a wholeness at the core of humanity that must abound in all we do, that wearies out all evil things and warms the depths of frozen fears. As a child, his deep, calm presence is what I remember most. As an adult, I poured through his writings, soaking in his Universalist perspective, his refusal to accept supremacies and superiorities, his translation of spiritual texts into a language of love, a language of hope for humanity, and his belief in the wholeness that lies at the core of all that is. I devoted much of my life to working towards seeking wholeness in the world around us. And in my travels, I have been so inspired by the commitment of so many people of all beliefs all over the world to nurture that wholeness, to nurture peace in their communities, and find love for one another and hope through one another, despite living through horrific trials and tribulations. So why, if it is this wholeness, this peace that people most desire, is the world trapped in this constant, ongoing cycle of violence? As we saw in the box exercise, when the limits of our perspectives are not acknowledged, and if these attitudes formed in isolation remain unexamined, they can form the basis of unconscious bias and the prejudices that so often follow. Thus, our lives can become separated from others, and the life force energy that connects us severed. In a letter attributed to Albert Einstein, it is said that he wrote to a friend who had just lost a child, "A human being is part of the whole. That person experiences themselves, their thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of their consciousness. An optical delusion of their consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison, restricting us to our own desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be, said Einstein, to be free from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. One way to understand Einstein's call for the widening of our circles is to embrace the practice of perspective taking, which we saw in the box, which requires us to become aware of the limited lenses through which we see the world and reach out to others to gain their perspective. Otherwise, we live in that prison that Einstein described, a prison of our own lack of self-awareness and lack of an awareness of the multidimensional world around us. Until recently, the focus of my peace building has always been in the world around us, and how the illusion of separation that Einstein identified is the root of the violence of supremacies among human beings. Over time, I came to realize that dispelling the illusion of separation needed to extend beyond the human community and to life itself, the whole world around us, to our plant and animal siblings, to the earth and sky and all that is. The notions that humans are superior to nature rather than a part of nature, and that it is the destiny of humans to dominate nature and extract from nature that which we desire, is another heresy, violating the sacredness of life and life force. Over the years, my childhood, one among many experience, has expanded to include all life forms, among the many of which I am but one. I came to understand my relationship to the natural world as akin to the human world, and that my kinship needed to extend to all life. The human world, which had been the context in which I experienced my entire existence, began to recede within this larger universe of life. Humanity's problems, as many and varied as they are, became but one dimension in my life, of the worlds within and the worlds without, as Thurman would say. In recent years, science and spirituality have converged in challenging the illusion of separation, that illusion that Einstein spoke of, and affirmed our interconnected reality. Quantum physics, noetic science are forming a contemporary explanation for ancient spiritual beliefs of the oneness of life, the non-dual nature of reality. Now, you may not believe this, but Dan Brown's new book, The Secret of Secrets, the author of the Da Vinci Code, is all about non-dual reality. And he spent 4 years with the quantum physicists and noetic scientists researching that story. It's a good one. But is there more to life than humanity and the natural world? What are we to make of Thurman's vision that there is a wholeness that lasts beyond the living and the dead, beyond the goals of peace, beyond the ends of war? This is a hard part for many activists to hear. It was a really hard part for me to hear. I have lived my life believing that it was my primary responsibility to heal humanity and the natural world and reform the systems and structures that are destroying both. I still believe that in my humanness, I am called to help with that healing. But I have come to believe that there is indeed more beyond the goals of peace and the end of war. This expansion of my understanding of reality inspired me to wrap up a career engaging human systems through peace building and justice seeking, and become a student again, a student of an expanded reality. While I continue to support the peace and justice movements by mentoring young activists around the world, my own explorations have turned to exploring more deeply the worlds within. This was accelerated shortly after I retired and moved to Santa Fe, when a doctor's routine exam discovered that I have a large descending aneurysm just above my heart, in the descending aorta. Here I was, in the best shape of my adult life, living a healthy life, retired from the stressful responsibilities of my work, and yet facing a potentially life-threatening health situation. For the first time in my life, I needed to face death personally. After the first barrage of medical investigation and treatment, I gradually found myself reflecting on human existence, more specifically, my human existence. I dove deep into existential questions about the relationship of which I was calling me to my body. Were they one and the same? Was this biomechanical suit that I call my body the container of my consciousness? When the body passes, is that the end of my consciousness? What if the life force energy that animates this body is not confined to this body? I read and reflected and occasionally shared my thoughts with very confused friends. Amidst the whirlwind of fears of death and questions about existence swirling within me, a still small voice began to speak. As family and friends became focused on my healing, I became fascinated with my death. My wife loved that part. I began to sense a consciousness in me that was not constricted to my body. I began to feel liberated from the constraints of my body, but not just my body, also from the human systems around me, particularly the political world that screams for our attention, often like a 2-year-old having a bad day. The cacophony of noise around me and within me began to recede. Things inside me got really quiet. I found myself craving silence and contemplation, and where better to do that than Santa Fe? Was I withdrawing from the world? Was I giving up? Had I lost my faith? Or was I balancing something in me, seeking ultimately to be complete and of one piece, within and without? In the months and now years that followed, I found myself seeking not to withdraw from the world, but to expand my world in the ways that Einstein suggested. First, by rejecting the illusion of separateness and embracing kinship with all living beings. Then, by experiencing consciousness beyond the body, a consciousness or wholeness that lasts beyond the living and the dead, a consciousness that connects everything that is or was or will be, a consciousness that seeks a deep and abiding peace, a consciousness that seeks to be complete and of one piece within and without. What I'm learning through this journey is that in a world in which fear is so often used to control people and countries and economies, all who seek to create peace must learn to move beyond our own fears, particularly the fear of death. When we are captured in fear, our days are often numbed. Our feelings, Michael helped me with this actually this morning when we were talking before the service. Our feelings begin to recede. We live in sort of an even-keeled state so as not to trigger the fear in us. I'm a grandchild of genocide. There's plenty of fear in my family lineage. If the essence of our beings, if our connection to life force, our consciousness, cannot be frightened into submission by threats, even threats of death, then we are free. Free to express our truest selves, our most loving selves, to liberate our spirits regardless of what madness may be happening around us, and thereby be a liberating force in the world. You sing this every Sunday. We sang this at Wellesley College at every interfaith service. Spirit of life, come to me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. On this day of peace, my hope, my prayer, my invitation, my plea is that in our incarnate forms, as life force energy humanizes our bodies for a time, may we embody the teachings of the wise ones and continue to work for peace and justice in the world around us as a way of honoring our interconnectedness with all humanity. That's okay, don't worry. That's interconnectedness. May we do this to honor our interconnectedness with all humanity, all life forms, and this earth upon which we dwell. And as conscious beings, not limited by our physical bodies, nor ultimately constrained by the human systems and structures around us, may we also honor the wisdom teachings of those like Howard Thurman, guiding us towards the fullness of our consciousness and our oneness with the life force energy that is now and will always be. May peace be with you now and always.